Hello, hello, llamas. Welcome back to another 30-minute demo with Etchr Studio. My name is Marian. I am your host here for today, and I am joined by the wonderful Jola, hailing over from the
Oh,
UK. We're really happy to have her back for another round with Etchr. Let me know in the chat if everything's all good on your end, if you can see and hear everything all good, and let us know where you're watching from. Today's demo, we have a couple of materials you may want to take a look at if you'd like to kind of join us for the whole thing today. In the video description, there is a link to a couple of reference photos. They're just a couple of line drawings of today's subject, which will be cherry blossoms. So you're more than welcome to pull that up and kind of follow along with the video that we have here for you today. And there's also, I believe, referenced examples of the paintings themselves.
yeah, that's
Yep,
right.
great. And okay, cool. We got people from Tacoma, Washington, and Mazatlan. I hope I said that right. Pennsylvania, Arizona, Canada. So we
Mhm.
are worldwide. We got a good amount of people joining us here today, Yola. We're really looking excited and forward to this. Um, Yeah, okay, so let me go through a couple things here, and then we'll get started. If you are new to Etchr Studio, we are an art learning platform that works with art teachers from all over the world. Yola, for example, is from the UK. Today's demo is a preview for her 90-minute class, which we'll talk more about when we get a little bit further along into our time here today. We also have a private Facebook group, so it's open to anyone making art related to both our free content and our paid classes. And I'll post a link in the chat for that if you haven't already joined. It's a really wonderful community, very tight knit. They love putting artwork that they've done in the classes. So if you like to have a community of like-minded individuals who love to make art, this may be the group for you. Okay. All right, so I am done blabbing. Yola, I'm going to go ahead and bring it on over to you. Why don't you let us know what we're doing here today?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Very happy to see all of you here. So today we're painting some cherry blossoms. Actually, we won't be painting the entire branch of a cherry blossoms. That will be in my mini workshop, which is on April 9th, I think. I should remember this.
Yes, it's
But
April 9th,
Yes,
Saturday.
okay, great. Okay, good. I got that right. So today we're breaking down the form of cherry blossoms into individual petals and kind of simpler shapes so we can get accustomed to the floral form, and also just to kind of make it into, smaller chunks so it's easier to develop muscle memory when you're painting florals. We're also going to be going through some transparency issues, let's say, so mixing colors, watercolors to achieve transparency and to be able to paint semi-transparent flowers such as cherry blossoms, which are very pale pink. The important thing to note here is that the techniques will be applicable to all sorts of flowers. They don't have to be used for cherry blossoms. You can use these techniques for painting white flowers, any kind of delicate flower that has quite a lot of transparency to it, that will be applicable to. And then the form of the petals will be applicable to lots of different flowers, because we're going to be looking at different angles of petals, kind of facing either forward or sideways or upside down. So basically, I'm trying to show you different ways to approach painting a flower and kind of break it down into individual steps to make it a bit easier. So that's what we're doing today.
Awesome. Okay, I got a request to post the link to the reference photos. So 1 second here, and I'll put that in the chat.
So just one note about the reference photos today. They will be actually attached to the live stream as well. So the video that you're going to see was recorded beforehand. That's me demonstrating all the techniques, and I'll be going through this, just with my voiceover, explaining everything. But the actual exercises today will be fairly simple in terms of the sketches that you'll need, because we'll be, painting individual petals, which are kind of like a teardrop shape. So nothing too major today. Don't stress yourself out with like a crazy sketch. What you're seeing right now in the screen, that's a cherry blossom branch. So that's what we're going to be painting on April 9th in the mini workshop. That's the full image and the full painting of a cherry blossom branch. So today we're doing something simpler, just the individual petals. So no need to worry too much about the sketches, but of course, I also provided some references like you see right now. So fairly simple individual petals. Yeah, there we go. That's roughly what we're going for today. You see individual petals kind of at different angles, also the flower bulbs and a bit of a branch as well, just, the branch isolated without the flowers. So everything to kind of, be able to have the building blocks in order to then move on to the actual branch later on. Here we have some examples of the different, slightly different cherry blossom branches. So again, on the 9th, we're going to be tackling this, something a little bit more complex than today. And here we're going with the class today. So first of all, I'm just going to walk you through the supplies I'm using. So today I'm using the Hahnemühle cold pressed paper. You don't have to be using the specific same one. I just recommend using cold pressed paper because it's got quite good texture, it's got quite a lot of tooth to it, and I feel like it lends itself very well to painting any kind of botanical illustrations and especially flowers because they just look so beautiful on that texture. I'm using this set of watercolors by Etchr. Again, you might have a completely different set in front of you, but this is the set I'm using today. I think we're having a bit of a delay, but that's okay. So most of the colors we'll be using are kind of shades of pink and red, and a little bit of brown as well for the branches. So we're going to be going through all the color mixing, but these are the colors we'll be focusing on. I'll also be mixing a little bit of yellow into some of the red mixes just to achieve these kind of really beautiful pale pink shades. But yeah, just mostly focusing on the pinks. These are the brushes I'll be using. I recommend having a few brushes because different sizes will allow you to do different things, of course. And I predominantly use round synthetic brushes. Doesn't really matter which brand you're using. I kind of have a mixture here. Here I have a pencil just for light sketching and a putty eraser. I recommend a putty eraser for your watercolor papers. And very importantly, please have at least 3 jars of water in front of you. I'm trying to show you all 3 with my 2 hands. There we go. So as you can see, one of them is already a little bit dirty, and that's going to be my dirty jar. So just getting rid of all the pigment in that jar. Here I'm spraying the palette with a bit of water. I recommend getting a spray bottle just to activate your watercolors before you sit down to paint. So let's jump right into it. I picked up my brush, and here are some of the colors that I already mixed up beforehand, but I will be mixing them kind of, adding more to them just so you can see what I'm doing. So I'm starting with a bit of a magenta tone, and first of all, I'm going to make some swatches. So I'm not painting the cherry blossoms yet, I'm just testing my colors. And so what I like to do is make little rectangles like this, just so I can see what the colors look like. This is the original color from the palette that was kind of like a magenta red mixture. I'm adding a little bit of water to this from my jar in order to dilute the color and just see what the mix is going to look like if I add a bit more water. Because essentially we need a very pale mix for the cherry blossoms. So now I got rid of even more of the pigment, and you can see I'm painting this square with almost hardly any pigment, but there's obviously a little bit of residue of the pigment in there, so I still have a bit of a pink shade to this. And this is roughly the transparency that I'm going for in the cherry blossoms. So as you can see, it's not much pigment at all. It's mostly water, but of course a little bit of the pigment as well. So you kind of have to think backwards, I would say, for transparent flowers. You have to think that you need to use a bit more water and less pigment. It has to be very subtle. So I'm just playing around with kind of, the different amounts of pigment in these swatches. Here I went on to add a little bit more pigment just to see, kind of the difference it makes when I add a tiny bit more to my brush. So I recommend that you experiment with these kind of things. Make swatches, see what the color looks like when it's very saturated, then add more water and see what it looks like when it's more washed down. And here I'm just continuing with swatches. So basically, before I sit down to paint anything, I always make these kind of, test mixing, color mixing tests, sorry. Just so I can, be prepared and I kind of have a vision for what colors I'm going to be using. and I don't have to stress about color mixing when I'm in the middle of the painting. So that's why I'm doing this right now. So here I'm just mixing a bit of a, well, that's a slightly different shade. This is a bit more red and a touch of yellow, I think. I'm sorry if you can't see the palette fully in the screen. My camera, unfortunately, doesn't have a wide angle. So, so this shade is slightly more red than the previous one. The previous one was a bit more pink with a bit more magenta pigment. This one is a little bit more red. But you can see that transparency will be, the level of transparency is similar, and that's what we're going for. Here, this color that I'm mixing right now is what's going to be in the middle of the flowers. So this is a dark purple. So the colors I used for this are predominantly red and magenta, plus a little bit of burnt umber. You can add a little bit of ultramarine blue as well, like dark blue, to get this kind of reddish purple, but I want this to be quite dark. I'm probably not going to be diluting it too much because it will be going into the middle of the petals to create contrast between the pale petals and the middle of the flower. So I'm just diluting this color here for you to see what it actually looks like. And yeah, it's a really nice pinkish purple, but I will be using it predominantly in its very saturated dark form. So I'm just moving on to some browns. That's going to be for the colors for the branches. Here I'm adding some burnt umber to the mix. I always kind of mix colors very, intuitively. I don't really think too much. I just go for it. So that's me in action. I'm just, very quickly going for it and trying to see what I can achieve. And I really like doing it this way, just because I can, I'm testing the colors beforehand anyway. So I kind of prepare myself for the painting that I'm about to do. So here I'm adding some more brown colors. I think this looks like burnt sienna. So I think this must have been burnt sienna. Bear in mind that the colors of the names of your colors might be a little bit different depending on what brand you're using. So I'm kind of just going with the most famous names. Here I'm adding a bit of ochre. So essentially I want at least 2 shades of brown, because the brown I'm showing you right now, this one, is going to be the base color for the branch, which is going to be like a lighter kind of yellowish brown. See, when you dilute it, it looks something like this. Beautiful color. And then the first brown that I showed you a second ago, am I going to show you the diluted version? I can't remember if I did that, but let's just take a look. The first brown was meant to be for the texture of the branch. So I'll be using 2 shades of brown, one lighter, one darker. Here I'm experimenting a little bit more with color mixing, as you can see. Added a little bit of red in there and going back to the ochre. So color mixing for me is probably one of the most fun parts of painting, because I'm always kind of exploring different options and different mixes that I can create. I'm trying to be very free about that. So I do recommend that you also just experiment with color mixing. Don't get too attached. Sometimes the most random mixes produce the most beautiful colors. So here I'm mixing another darker brown. It's a little bit lighter than the first one. I think the first one is probably a little bit too dark for our purpose. So, you just have to kind of mix a few colors and decide what you want to use. So this one is going to be probably a little bit better because it's not like super, super dark.
Yola.
Yes.
So someone asked about your brushes. In the video description, you wrote the Princeton Neptune size 10 and 3. Is that what you're using right now?
So this one you can see right now, that is the Princeton Neptune, indeed. Okay. I'm just wondering whether we can pause it for a second, just so I can answer the question. Yeah, so the brush you see right now in the screen, that's the Princeton Neptune size 10, an amazing brush, probably one of my favorites. I actually only have one size of this brush. I don't have any more sizes, so I need to probably buy more because it's really good. But then the other brushes you might see me using when I'm going to go into the details, that will be, I think, a Winsor & Newton brush, and then I have an Etchr brush as well. So I don't attach myself to just one brand, so I just wanted to put it out there. But yeah, this one you're seeing right now, that's the Neptune one, and it's really good. I can recommend it.
All right, cool. All right, we'll continue.
So here I'm starting with the first petal shape. So if you are more comfortable with sketching that beforehand, please feel free to use the references that are in the description. I'm starting with a bit of wet and wet. So essentially, I've put a little bit of clean water on the petal shape, the first petal shape, which is kind of like a teardrop shape. So we have a layer of clean water in there, and now I'm dropping in a little bit of pink into this. So notice how much pigment I'm using. I'm testing this on the side in here, so you can see that the mix is very transparent. It doesn't have that much saturation in it whatsoever. So I'm just dropping that in here. That's dropping the wet pigment onto a wet surface because I've put the clean water on the petal. And so now I'm just pushing this pigment around. And essentially, I don't want to have the entire shape covered with pigment. I just wanted to go kind of on the sides and just disperse it around the shape. Because if you went to cover the entire shape with the color, it would start looking flat. What we want to do is create a bit of contrast and a bit of dimension. So now go back to your palette and pick up a little more of the same color and just a little bit more pigment this time. So basically what we're doing, we're building contrast, building dimension this way. And as you can see, I'm still pushing the pigment around. So with the brush, I'm kind of, always moving it around the shape that I'm painting. It's never really in a linear move. Of course, that is just my technique, but you might find slightly different moves more effective for you. But in terms of pushing the pigment, that's what I do. I kind of flick around with my brush, always use a kitchen towel to get rid of some excess pigment, excess water. And you can also push the pigment around this way, with a slightly drier brush to make sure that you're not getting puddles of water. Make sure that your pigment is not concentrated in just like one area. You want kind of a nice smooth gradient between the slightly darker pink and the very pale pink. So I intentionally left the middle a little bit paler with less pigment, so it looks kind of white. Here you can see I switched to the detail brush. That's the Etchr detail brush. And I went for that purple I was just describing, the very dark purple. So I'm not diluting this color. As you can see, I loaded the brush up with quite an intense purple. And this will be the middle of the flower. So this will create a lot of contrast because you have a very pale petal and then the middle is very dark. Here we have a side view, just so you can see kind of, from a different angle. We are working on a petal which is sideways. It's going to be kind of horizontal because essentially this petal will be what you would paint in a full floral piece if you're looking at a flower from an angle. So it's the same idea every time. We're going to be loading the petal shape with water, although I will show you a different way of doing it as well in a minute. But we're then applying the color kind of, just making sure we don't have any strict borders between the more saturated and the paler washes, always pushing the pigment around, and then we're finishing off with adding the contrasting dark color at the end of the petal, where it would be connecting to the actual flower. This petal is going to be very similar to the one I just did a second ago. It's just going to be facing the other way. So essentially, again, building blocks of an actual flower, sorry.
Yola, there's a question here that I thought was really good. I guess with the beginners in mind, how do you remember how you mix the color and what colors you use to mix that swatch?
That is a very good question, which I have tried answering before, and I'm not sure how satisfactory the answer will be. But the way I do it is pretty random in the sense that, unfortunately, I'm not one of those, technically minded. I'm just not very minded to remember things. So basically, I have a visual memory, and I very much like to get accustomed to my art supplies. So whenever I have a new set, I make swatches, I test all the colors, I see what the colors look like, because every time you buy a new set, and they might look slightly different depending on what brand you're using. So I know my art supplies very well. So, depending on what set I'm using, kind of roughly know what colors I have in each set. And that's how I guide myself. That's one way of doing it. Just really getting to know your art supplies and remembering kind of, how the colors look like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, someone suggested that they just write down notes on their paper what colors they used.
Yes, I know a lot of people do that, and I have tried that in the past. It didn't work for me. I just disregarded the notes. I was always just like doing my own thing. It's almost like I was battling with myself. It's like, I'm not going to listen to what you told me, even though it was myself, which is crazy, but that's the truth. So I kind of always just approach it, like this. But another thing to note here, very important to get accustomed with basics of color theory. I always mention that in my longer workshops. Color theory in the sense of, understanding the color wheel and how colors work together, and contrasting colors as well, and how to mix colors using the color wheel. So I always mention that in my longer workshops. If you're interested, then we can discuss that another time. But yeah, that's also a huge part of this.
Sure. All right, we'll move on here.
I think a shape. Oh, okay. Sorry, I was just trying to figure out what I was doing here. So the shape we're going to paint now is going to be this petal kind of that I'm pointing to right now, which is kind of wide and horizontal. It looks a bit like a boat. That's going to be roughly the shape. So the petal I'm going to demonstrate right now will be very useful for when we're painting the full branch, and we're going to be painting these flowers which are pointing up. So imagine that the rest of the petals are going to be at the back of this petal, and this one is going to be kind of closest to us. But the reason why it's at this strange angle, which you might not, it looks like a boomerang, so you might not think of a flower when you look at it. But depending on the perspective of the flower, that you might find that this would be the appropriate angle to look at it. So I'm just showing you kind of different ways to approach a flower, and believe me, it makes much more sense when you actually reach the full composition of a full branch. It makes much more sense.
I love this exercise. Like, this is such a great exercise to do for any flower, really, if you just really want to study, the shapes and the colors and stuff. Yeah.
I think so. I mean, like, a great way to approach any kind of floral paintings is to find some reference images, or take your own reference images and try to just pick one petal to focus on and just see what shape it is, because it can be quite overwhelming with flowers. I mean, they're, very popular for painting subjects, but actually they're very complicated in terms of how to get them to look realistic, more or less. So looking at individual petals, I find, is the best way to do it. Here, what we're going to do is paint a little flower bud. So, in cherry blossoms and other flowers as well, you're going to also have flowers which haven't, bloomed yet. So they're still in the stage of getting ready to bloom. So they will usually be a little bit more saturated, a little bit more colorful, because they have much more, concentrated color in them. So this is kind of like a shape of a bulb. It's kind of circular, not a perfect circle though. So that's why I'm using much more pigment for this one. And it's quite a saturated, dark-ish red. But again, as you can see what I'm doing, I'm not covering the entire shape with the color. I'm trying to leave some empty gaps and some more transparent parts of the petal, just to preserve that, dimensionality, I suppose you would say, or you want to have some highlights in there just so you can show the shape. Of course, if you're new to flower painting, I would recommend loading up loads of different reference images, or again, taking your own and just really taking some time to look at those pictures and see what these shapes look like. Because I understand that, of course, if you're completely new to this, you might be like, this shape is very weird. So it's very important to look at some reference images beforehand. Okay, so yeah, sometimes I try to make sure I have enough pigment in there, so I just drop in a little bit more. And let's see what's up next. It's really funny watching myself, because obviously I'm trying to also remember exactly the shape that I'm painting right now. Let's see.
Yeah, so far the comments have been very happy. They're finding this very enjoyable and informative. So
I'm glad. I know that it can be, it can be a little bit challenging to show you, everything step by step. Obviously, we have a bit of a time constraint, but I'm hoping that this is comprehensible. We're having another petal here. Okay, so I'm trying to also show you that you can also use a little bit more saturated color into your petals, depending on, sometimes maybe a certain flower will be positioned in a way that has more shadow on it, and so then they will look a little bit darker. And so you want to also think about the saturation in your composition. So some of the petals will be lighter, some of them might be a little bit darker, just for that variety. Here I'm adding another petal joined to the previous one. And this is kind of a demonstration of how you can start joining your petal shapes. So of course, in the final, in the bigger piece, you want to be able to join these petals together, make sense of them, and kind of join them in a way that looks more or less realistic. So here I'm just showing you how to do that with 2 petals. And you might have noticed that I'm always painting the petals a little bit differently. So I don't really, because it's a loose floral kind of illustration, they're not meant to be very realistic paintings. That we preserve the shape and we preserve the colors more or less. And we're definitely inspired by the real thing, but there's still quite a lot of room for, like a whimsical style. And so each petal I'm going to be approaching slightly differently. As you can see, for this one, I'm adding a little bit more like magenta, pink on the left, and then on the right-hand side, it's a little bit more red. So I want to play around with these things. I don't want to, restrain myself and always paint them the same way, because I think it's a little bit more fun if you have some playfulness in there. This one, I'm also painting another flower bud. You might have noticed that I went in straight away with very intense, like pink-red pigment in here. I didn't put any clean water on this one, so you can most definitely go in with a wet paint onto a dry surface as well. You don't always have to do it wet on wet. So I started with quite an intense red, and then I just kind of builded it from there. The strokes on the right-hand side that I just added were done with much more water, so I got rid of some of the intense red, and I just added another little stroke on the right-hand side. So then the flower bud looks a little bit more dimensional as well. So the left-hand side is a little bit darker, the right-hand side is a little bit paler. Here I'm switching to another brush. So as you can see, I'm kind of using 3 brushes at the same time, depending on what I'm painting right now. Okay, so here we're going to add a very tiny little, I think that's what I'm going to be doing, the little leaves that appear on cherry blossoms. I'm pretty sure that's what I'm doing. Let me take a look. I'm mixing up the dark purple again. So again, okay, this is the same, more or less the same color as I mixed before for the middle of the flower. So the intense dark purple / red purple. And I think I'm going to add little leaves. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So as you can see, I'm just trying to add very whimsical, quite simple leaves to some of these flower buds. If you take a look at some reference pictures of cherry blossoms, you'll see they have these really beautiful, like burgundy leaves. That's what they would look like in the final composition. You kind of intertwine them between the leaves and the branch, so you kind of add another element to your composition. That also helps you to build the contrast and the texture, because it kind of throws you off. All the petals are very pale, but the leaves are pretty dark. So that gives you kind of a nice overview of different techniques within one composition as well. We're going to move on to painting a little branch. So again, it's an isolated branch, so no flowers on it. Picking up the first brown, so this is the kind of like a lighter brown that I mixed. And I'm just going to put the first layer of brown on this outline of the branch. Now, of course, you can make the branch in a slightly different shape. I like to make it a little bit wonky. I don't want the branch to be, like in a straight line. I think it's a bit more interesting when you have a bit of unevenness in there. So I'm just putting the first layer of brown literally just on the outline of the shape. Like so. Kind of be very free with the shape itself, as I said, so you can add a few more branches in there, like coming off of the main stem. So this will be the first layer of brown. Now watercolors dry, when they dry, they become paler. So even though this brown might look a little bit, dark at this point, when it dries, it will go paler. Which is why I then mixed the darker brown, because I will be coming in with the detail brush to get a little bit of texture in there and add some, just some texture to the branch itself. So in the meantime, when the branch is drying, I'm coming back to some of the petals to show you how to add texture. So like how to add these fine lines. You know, when you look up on an individual petal, they have a bit of a line texture, you know, that kind of like wrinkles. So I'm using my detail brush. It's a very small brush, as you can see, and I'm still using a very diluted version of a pink. So it's just slightly darker, a little bit more pigment than the base color in here, but still very pale. I really hope you can see it well. I know that it's a detail brush, so it might be a little bit difficult to see. But here I'm just adding texture, essentially. So the way I would explain it, you know, you can have loose floral pieces, loose floral paintings without any texture, and that's absolutely fine. But if you're like me, if you're actually really into adding texture to your paintings, this is something you can do. So I always like to add a little bit of texture just for that more, you know, kind of a little bit more of an interesting twist on your illustration. So I'm just going to go over very lightly the petals that I've painted, and adding these like little wrinkles. I know you might not be able to see them very well, but that's what I'm doing essentially. So again, quite a diluted mix of pink, not too dark at all. You don't want this to be very dark, because if it was very dark all of a sudden, then it would look, you know, out of place. And I think it would overpower the pale value of the petals. So you have to be quite careful to make the mix fairly light. As you can see, I'm always testing the mix on the left-hand side. So I always have a test sheet next to me, because I don't want to risk putting like, you know, a very dark, color on my painting. So
There's
yeah,
a question
very
here.
light.
Hi, Jola. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt
No.
you. So at this point, the petals are completely dry before you are doing these details?
Yes, these are dry. The video, mind you, is a little bit sped up, like a tiny bit. So, you know, of course, the process might take you a little bit longer. We have a time constraint, so that's why. But yeah, so they are already dry. I wouldn't recommend coming in with the details when it's still wet, because it will merge with the base layer. So try to wait for everything to dry, or if you're not patient, you can also use a hair dryer. That's very common. As for this one, okay, so here I'm adding the detail as well, but because the flower bud was originally darker and more saturated, you can get away with using even a darker tone. So slightly darker than the previous petals, the texture here, but again, still adding some, you know, wrinkles and uneven lines just to make it a little bit more edgy. So yeah, these shapes are all dry at this point, because I was waiting for the branch to dry. So in the meantime, I went back to my petals. This is kind of the process you go through. You're also adding some texture to the leaves. Now, another reason to add texture, this is not just like me actually really liking the texture. Of course it is mostly that, but as I said earlier, watercolor also always dries paler than it is when it is wet. So, you know, the pigment kind of sinks into the paper, the water evaporates, so it loses that shine. And so adding texture really helps. Here with the detail brush, I went back to that dark purple that I mixed. And as you can see in this piece, in the final piece, we have the, I don't know what you'd call that, the pollen, I think, maybe the little dots that you have inside the flower. And so with the detail brush, I was just adding a few of these really dark purple dots, and that was also a part of texture, but it's a very integral part of the flowers. And here, again, with the texture. So again, we're just on the texture stage right now, but the branch has dried already. Of course, please bear in mind the video is sped up a little bit, so you know it might be a little bit slower at your end. But here you can see I'm adding this dark brown that I mixed earlier. So this is the dark brown, and I'm adding these kind of loose strokes, kind of randomly, just to add a bit of texture. And now I went back and added a tiny bit more water to the brush, diluted some of the color on some of the brown. And when the first strokes, the very dark strokes, are still a little bit wet, I'm just coming in with a bit more water and pushing that pigment around. And this way, I'm creating texture. So again, I don't want my branch to be flat. I want to have a bit of, like, you know, kind of like a tactile texture to it. So you can really achieve that with simple strokes. Just make sure you disperse them and kind of move the pigment around a little bit to make it smoother. Let's see. Okay, so I think that was okay. That was the presentation. I'm trying to catch up with myself. So this is the final painting that we'll be approaching on the 9th of April. So essentially, all the petals you can see here, the shapes are pretty much the elements that we discussed today, different angles, different positioning, and also adding the texture to the final pieces as well.
Beautiful. Yola, this was incredibly valuable, informative, fun, beautiful to watch you do. And when you get a chance to take a look at the chat, there's just a lot of like awe and ooze throughout. Okay, everybody. Yeah, so there's been a couple of questions here. So we'll go through a really quick Q&A and then we'll kind of
Absolutely.
talk about your mini workshop here. Let's see. So yes, actually, I'm not seeing a whole lot of questions other than this one, but for everyone else who's watching, if you want to ask something to Yola, this would be the time to do so. So go ahead and put it in the chat. A person here is asking that your size 10 brush doesn't seem pointy. Would you recommend a non-pointy brush for painting flower petals in the way that you did?
Yes, I'll show the brush to you in here right now to the camera. So
Yeah,
there we go. It's actually not very pointy at all. It is pretty round, this one. There's some noise outside, sorry about that. And well, it depends on the brand and the style you buy, because for example, here with this brush, it's slightly smaller. That's a Winsor & Newton, but this one is a little bit pointier. So essentially, I would say that you have to take a look in the art store when you're buying, like, you know, what kind of finish it has, because this one's quite round, but it will depend on the brand. And then for florals, I would actually recommend the rounded ones, just because that's why I was using it for the petals, because you can get really kind of oblique shapes with it. Mm-hmm. So I find that using a rounded brush is a little bit more gentle. I think some of the, you know, kind of pointy brush, you can make the strokes quite angular, which doesn't necessarily lend itself so well to like smooth flowers. So especially for cherry blossoms, I would say, or anything similar, rounded brush would be perfect. But, you know, again, you just have to explore your art supplies, because every brand will be different. So that's another fun part of watercolor painting. That you always have, you know, multiple things to think about: the supplies, the technique, the paper you're using, the pigment. So I don't know if that answered your questions. I hope so.
I think it does. Yeah, thank you. And we did talk more about the brushes earlier. So for those of you who joined a little bit later, feel free to rewatch this. We did talk about the brushes at some point. The list of materials is also in the video description, so you're welcome to go through that. Okay, great. And so there's just been so many questions or comments really of how beautiful. Thank you so much, Yola. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So lovely, so delicate. I'm watching breathless. Like, wow.
Oh,
That's
goodness.
such a beautiful comment.
No, I hope you're not breathless. We don't want that.
Yeah, and Carol here says that practicing different blossoms before doing the painting is such a great idea. I'm doing this from now on. Thank you so much. Very
I think
great.
it just helps you to kind of, you know, break it down into smaller steps. Any subject that you find overwhelming for whatever reason, you know, sometimes a certain subject might be more difficult to you than it is to other people, and it doesn't matter. It's just, you know, that's just how it is. So what I would suggest is break it down to, you know, smaller chunks, whatever that might be. So if you're scared of painting, I don't know, an apple, just try to focus on the color first, just the, you know, the red shades that you might find in an apple. So always try to find the thing that's like a little bit easier, and then from then on, you can go and tackle the bigger subject.
Absolutely. Okay, so one more question here, and then this may lead into our talking about the mini workshop. So Marion is asking, will some of the red be mixed with the brown for the branches, or are they just Umbra and Sienna?
The branches were predominantly browns, yes. Actually, the names of the colors in the Etchr palette are completely different, so I'm just kind of guessing that because they're very similar to the colors that I mentioned, which is ochre and sienna and sienna and ochre. But yeah, they would be, so the lighter brown was like a raw sienna with a bit of burnt umber, I think. no, burnt sienna, sorry. Raw sienna, burnt sienna for the lighter one. And then the darker one would have been burnt umber, and I can't remember now. But yeah, so they would be mostly browns in there. I don't think
So
I
it
added any.
doesn't really mix with the red from the petals.
No, I mean, for the petals or for the branch?
So I think what she's asking is, does the red and brown kind of mix at any point where they meet when you painting the branches?
So for the branch itself, I didn't use any red, no. But for the, for example, for the darker purplish red for the middle of the flowers, that would be a little bit of red. You can actually get away with adding a little bit of brown into that mix just to make it a little bit darker, but I wouldn't go overboard because you don't want it to make it brown. So for the middle of the flower, if that's also interesting to someone, that would be kind of like a magenta color. Again, the names might be different in your palette, with a little bit of cadmium red, I would suggest. And you can also add a little bit of ultramarine blue, because ultramarine blue is going to mix with the reds and give you a little bit of a purple hue, purple shade. So just a little bit of blue, that could really work wonders for the actual, like, intense purple.
Awesome. Okay, great. Now let's briefly go over your mini workshop. So why should people watching today sign up for your mini workshop, the 90-minute class?
So today we were just, kind of breaking everything down into smaller steps into how to look at a flower and how to approach painting kind of like individual flowers. But the class will be talking also about the composition that you might want to achieve in your flower pieces. So personally, when I was learning how to paint flowers, I always struggled to think how I can make them look kind of lively on the page and kind of have quite a lot of, interesting energy or composition. So in the class, we're going to be talking about the composition. So we're going to start off with a sketch and how to place your flowers just so they don't look, either kind of uneven on the page, just so you have like a good balance, but also the direction of the flowers in terms of which way they're facing to make it look a little bit more realistic, even though it's a kind of like a loose floral style. And then we'll be joining everything together in one composition. But of course, there will be much more talk about how to also place your flowers kind of in front of the branch, for example. So not just putting everything in kind of like one level. So we're going to have a bit of overlapping elements as well, so that one flower can look like it's behind the other one, or half of the branch might be kind of hidden between or whatever the word is. Behind, there we go, behind the flower, and kind of thinking about the composition most of the time, like during the class. So adding the texture as well and how to make everything look like it's kind of has like a coherent dance to it. So that's the reason, and it takes quite a lot of time to get this through. So 45 minutes is not enough to kind of talk through the composition and all these aspects. So that's what we're going to be doing in the class.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jola. That was a really great explanation. And yeah, everybody, we hope to see you there at the 90-minute class. It is on April 9th. So remember, you can support Jola by grabbing a seat. If you do not want to subscribe, you can buy the class for just US $7, same amount as a cup of coffee. Or, if you do want to give our platform a chance, you can sign up for a 7-day free trial to access this class, as well as all of the other classes that we already have in our library, hundreds of hours of content. So if you love art and want to make more, Etchr has got your back. We got a little bit of everything. So Yola's class, as you mentioned, will be pretty much broken down like a step-by-step tutorial, but you will be learning these techniques and applying them into this floral composition, as she said. If you cannot make it, though, the recording will be available a few days later. All the details are in the links that I put in the chat. And I put a whole bunch of other links there. Please let us know how we did. If you want to give us feedback, I posted a link to our survey. Just let us know how we're doing, what we can do more of. If you want to give Jola some kudos and praise, we welcome that as well. And yeah, I believe that's about it. Jola, this was such a great demonstration. I think everyone absolutely loved it. Do you have any last words before we decide to, before we close off today?
Well, thank you everyone for joining. That was really fun. Always fun for me to also watch myself paint and then talk over it. That's quite a challenge, but it's actually really informative for myself too. Just wanted to mention one thing that a lot of people ask me, how do you paint white flowers? So just wanted to mention the fact that, we're painting cherry blossoms today and in this series of classes, but we're focusing on how to tone down and how to use as little pigment as possible for the flowers, which look semi-transparent. And so the techniques we're practicing here are pretty much what leads you to painting white flowers as well, except we wouldn't necessarily be using as much pink pigment. So the techniques are very much applicable to other flowers that you might want to tackle as well, not just cherry blossoms.
Okay.
Just to put it out there.
Great. Thank you for that. And on that note, if you're watching this recording later, let us know in the comments of this video below what other kind of flowers you would like to try this technique with. If it's not just white flowers, maybe a specific flower in mind, let us know in the chat, or excuse me, in the comments below, what kind of flowers that other than cherry blossoms that you would like to try these techniques that you learned here today. Okay. All right, everybody. Thank you again so much for joining us at Etchr Studio. My name is Marian. Again, we had a really great time today. We hope to see you all at the 90-minute class. Until next time, we'll see you again. Make more art. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.